Elena Reed thought she knew what betrayal looked like. She was wrong. When her husband Marcus left for his third deployment to Afghanistan, she expected the usual challenges: loneliness, sleepless nights, counting days on the calendar. What she didn't expect was to come home from her nursing shift at Denver General Hospital to find her sister Natalie's car in her driveway at 2 in the morning, or to discover that the man she'd been married to for 6 years had been planning his exit strategy since before he even shipped out. This isn't just another story about military marriages falling apart. This is about how Elena discovered that her husband had been systematically draining their joint accounts, forging her signature on legal documents, and worst of all, using military regulations she didn't understand to ensure she'd be left with nothing when the dust settled. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Elena should have seen the signs earlier, but love has a way of making you blind to the obvious. Marcus Rodriguez had always been charming. That's what drew her to him when they met at a 4th of July barbecue in Colorado Springs 7 years ago. He was stationed at Fort Carson then, a staff sergeant with the 4th Infantry Division, and she was fresh out of nursing school, working her first job at the base hospital. Their courtship was a whirlwind of stolen moments between his training exercises and her 12-hour shifts. Marcus would show up at the hospital cafeteria during her breaks with coffee and those crooked smiles that made her forget she was exhausted. He talked about his future plans, getting promoted, maybe moving to a bigger base, starting a family. Elena fell hard and fast for his confidence and apparent devotion. They married at a small chapel in Colorado Springs in October 2017. Elena's sister Natalie was her maid of honor, flying in from Phoenix where she worked as a real estate agent. Even then, Elena noticed how Natalie seemed to hang on Marcus's every word during the reception, laughing too loudly at his jokes and finding excuses to touch his arm while they talked. But Elena brushed it off as wedding nerves and too much champagne. The first deployment came 8 months after their wedding. Marcus was sent to Iraq for 9 months with his unit. Elena threw herself into work, picking up extra shifts and sending care packages filled with his favorite snacks and letters sprayed with her perfume. The communication was sporadic but normal for deployment: video calls when the connection allowed, emails when it didn't, and the occasional phone call that cut out mid-sentence. When Marcus returned, something felt different. He was more distant, quicker to anger, and strangely secretive about his phone. Elena attributed it to deployment stress and readjustment issues. She'd seen it countless times with patients at the hospital, soldiers coming back changed, struggling to reconnect with civilian life. She gave him space and time, convinced that patience and understanding would fix whatever was broken. The second deployment to Syria lasted 10 months and followed a similar pattern, except this time Marcus seemed almost eager to leave. He talked about the mission with an enthusiasm that felt forced, and Elena caught him on his phone at odd hours, quickly closing applications when she walked into the room. When she asked about it, he'd snap about operational security and how she wouldn't understand military protocols. During that second deployment, Natalie started visiting more frequently. She claimed she was lonely after her latest relationship ended and wanted to spend time with her sister. Elena welcomed the company, grateful for someone to share dinner with and watch movies on the couch. Natalie would stay for weeks at a time, working remotely from Elena's home office and helping with household tasks that felt overwhelming when tackled alone. It was during one of these visits that Elena first noticed Natalie knew details about Marcus's deployment that she shouldn't have known. Little things, mentioning that his unit had moved to a new base before Elena had heard about it, or knowing about a training exercise that Marcus hadn't mentioned in their last video call. When Elena questioned her about it, Natalie laughed it off, claiming she'd heard Elena mention it and just remembered better. Marcus returned from Syria in March 2022, and this time the changes were impossible to ignore. He was cold, almost clinical in his interactions with Elena. Physical intimacy became rare and felt mechanical when it did happen. He started working late at the base more frequently, claiming increased responsibilities as he prepared for promotion to Sergeant First Class. The promotion came through that summer, along with news of a third deployment, this time to Afghanistan for what would be a 12-month rotation. Elena felt her heart sink when Marcus delivered the news over dinner at their favorite steakhouse in Colorado Springs. But what crushed her wasn't the deployment itself. It was the way he delivered it, matter-of-factly, like he was reading from a manual rather than telling his wife he'd be gone for a year. The weeks leading up to his departure were tense and awkward. Marcus seemed to be going through the motions of preparing for deployment while simultaneously preparing for something else entirely. He spent hours on his laptop, often late into the night, working on what he claimed were mission briefs and training materials. When Elena suggested they spend more quality time together before he left, he brushed her off with excuses about pre-deployment requirements. 3 days before Marcus was scheduled to leave, Elena came home from a particularly brutal shift at the hospital to find him in their bedroom packing his civilian clothes into storage containers rather than his military duffel bags. When she asked why he was packing clothes he wouldn't need during deployment, Marcus became defensive and evasive. He mumbled something about consolidating their belongings and making space for when he returned. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. Something felt fundamentally wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on what. She replayed conversations from the past few months, looking for clues she might have missed. Marcus's behavior had been strange, but she'd attributed it to pre-deployment stress. Now, lying in the dark, listening to him breathe beside her, she wondered if there was something more sinister at play. The next morning brought an argument that would be their last real conversation as husband and wife. Elena had found bank statements on Marcus's desk, statements for accounts she didn't know existed. When she confronted him about it, he exploded with a rage she'd never seen before. He accused her of snooping, of not trusting him, of being paranoid and controlling. The words cut deep because they came from nowhere. Elena had always given Marcus the benefit of the doubt, even when her instincts told her something was wrong. Marcus left for his deployment on a Thursday morning in September 2022. Their goodbye was stilted and uncomfortable, nothing like the tearful farewells they'd shared during his previous deployments. Elena watched his taxi disappear down their suburban Denver street and felt a strange sense of relief mixed with dread. Part of her was glad he was gone. The tension in their house had become unbearable. But another part of her feared that this deployment would be different, that something irreversible was about to happen. The first month of deployment followed a predictable pattern. Marcus called twice a week, usually brief conversations about logistics, bills that needed paying, maintenance issues with the house, updates from his unit. The calls felt more like business meetings than conversations between spouses. Elena tried to inject warmth and intimacy into their exchanges, sharing stories from work or asking about his daily routine, but Marcus remained distant and distracted. It was during the second month that Natalie announced she was taking a leave of absence from her real estate job in Phoenix. She claimed she was burned out and needed a change of scenery. Elena, lonely and struggling with the isolation of deployment life, welcomed her sister with open arms. Natalie moved into their guest room with 2 large suitcases and promised to help Elena maintain the house and garden while Marcus was away. Having Natalie around made the days more bearable, but Elena soon noticed her sister's behavior was odd. Natalie would disappear for hours at a time without explanation, claiming she was exploring Denver or meeting potential networking contacts. She was secretive about her phone calls, often stepping outside or into another room when it rang. Most strangely, she seemed to know things about Marcus's deployment schedule and location that Elena didn't know herself. The breaking point came on a cold November evening when Elena returned home early from work due to a power outage at the hospital. She expected to find Natalie in the living room watching television or working on her laptop. Instead, she found her sister in the master bedroom, sitting on Elena's bed with her laptop open, engaged in what was clearly a video call with someone who wasn't visible on the screen. Elena stood in the doorway, frozen, as she heard her sister's voice, intimate, flirtatious, completely different from how Natalie usually spoke. The conversation was peppered with military terminology and references to locations that Elena recognized from Marcus's deployment emails. When Natalie finally noticed Elena standing there, she quickly closed the laptop and launched into an elaborate explanation about consulting with a friend who was also deployed overseas. But Elena had heard enough. In that moment, standing in her own bedroom, watching her sister scramble to justify her presence there, Elena finally understood what had been happening. The strange behavior, the secretive phone calls, the inside knowledge about Marcus's deployment, it all clicked into place with a sickening clarity that made her stomach lurch. Elena's hands shook as she closed the bedroom door behind her and walked straight to the kitchen. She needed something to do with her hands, something normal to ground herself while her world tilted sideways. She started washing dishes that were already clean, scrubbing the same plate over and over while her mind raced through every interaction she'd witnessed between Marcus and Natalie over the past few years. Natalie appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later, her laptop tucked under her arm and a bright smile plastered on her face. She launched into chatter about her day as if Elena hadn't just caught her in their bedroom having an intimate conversation with someone overseas. Elena let her sister ramble while studying her face, really looking at her for the first time in months. Natalie had lost weight, was wearing makeup more often, and had started dressing differently since moving in. Changes Elena had attributed to her sister wanting to reinvent herself after her supposed breakup. That night, Elena lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Natalie watched television in the living room. Every laugh track from whatever show her sister was watching felt like mockery. Elena pulled out her phone and scrolled through months of text messages from Marcus, looking for clues she'd missed. The messages were brief, functional, devoid of any real emotion or intimacy. She compared them to the messages from his previous deployments. Those had been longer, warmer, filled with inside jokes and expressions of love. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The next morning, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She called in sick to work, something she'd never done unless she was genuinely ill, and waited for Natalie to leave for one of her mysterious errands. Then she went to work like a detective in her own home. Elena started with the guest room where Natalie had been staying. She felt sick going through her sister's belongings, but the alternative was living with the gnawing certainty that something was wrong without having proof. In Natalie's suitcase, tucked between folded sweaters, Elena found a small jewelry box she didn't recognize. Inside was a silver bracelet with a military dog tag charm, Marcus's dog tag charm. Elena had given him that bracelet for their first anniversary, and he'd sworn he'd never take it off. But the real smoking gun was Natalie's laptop. She'd left it charging on the desk, and Elena knew her sister's password. Natalie had never been good at digital security. Elena's heart pounded as she opened the laptop and navigated to the email application. What she found there destroyed any remaining doubt about what was happening. Months of emails between Natalie and Marcus stretched back to before his current deployment. The early messages were flirtatious, but could be dismissed as friendly banter between in-laws. But as Elena scrolled through the timeline, the correspondence became increasingly intimate and explicit. By August, just weeks before Marcus's deployment, they were making detailed plans for their future together. The emails revealed that Marcus had been planning to leave Elena for over a year. He and Natalie had been conducting their affair through encrypted messaging apps and video calls, carefully coordinating their communication to avoid detection. Marcus had been feeding Natalie information about his deployment schedule, his financial accounts, and even Elena's work schedule to help them plan their meetings and calls. But the most devastating discovery was a series of emails from September, right after Marcus deployed. He and Natalie had been discussing logistics for when he returned, not to Elena, but to start a new life with Natalie. Marcus had apparently been researching military divorce procedures and had already consulted with a lawyer about how to maximize his financial position while minimizing Elena's claim to marital assets. Elena printed everything, every email, every attachment, every piece of evidence that documented the systematic destruction of her marriage. Her hands were steady now, her mind clear with purpose. The hurt would come later. Right now, she needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with. The emails revealed that Marcus had been manipulating their joint finances for months before his deployment. He'd opened individual accounts that Elena didn't know about and had been systematically transferring money from their shared accounts. The timing was strategic. He knew Elena rarely checked their bank statements during deployment, trusting him to handle their finances while he was overseas. More disturbing were Marcus's references to military divorce laws and his apparent belief that his deployment status would give him advantages in divorce proceedings. He'd written to Natalie about how military courts favor active-duty service members, especially those deployed in combat zones. He seemed confident that Elena would be left with minimal assets and no recourse. The final piece of the puzzle was buried in an email thread from October. Marcus had been granted early leave for December, something he hadn't mentioned to Elena. According to his correspondence with Natalie, he planned to return to Colorado on leave, finalize divorce paperwork, and then report to a new duty station in California where Natalie would join him. They'd already started looking at apartments in San Diego. Elena sat back in the desk chair, surrounded by printed emails and bank statements, feeling like she was drowning in evidence of her own naivety. How had she missed so many signs? How had she trusted two people who'd been systematically deceiving her for over a year? The sound of Natalie's key in the front door snapped Elena out of her shock. She quickly gathered all the printed evidence and stuffed it into a manila envelope, then closed the laptop and returned everything to exactly how she'd found it. By the time Natalie walked into the guest room, Elena was sitting on her own bed across the hall, apparently scrolling through her phone. "How was your morning?" Natalie asked, her voice bright with false cheer. "Fine," Elena replied, studying her sister's face. "Just catching up on some reading." That afternoon, Elena drove to the base where she worked and requested a meeting with the Family Readiness Coordinator, Captain Sarah Mitchell. Elena had always liked Captain Mitchell. She was direct, competent, and genuinely cared about military families. More importantly, she understood military law and could explain Elena's rights and options. Captain Mitchell listened without interruption as Elena explained the situation, showing her copies of the most damning emails and financial documents. The captain's expression grew increasingly grim as she reviewed the evidence. "Elena, I need you to understand something. What Marcus is doing, the financial manipulation, the fraudulent transfers, the attempt to hide assets during deployment, these aren't just violations of your marriage vows. They're violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. This is a military legal matter now." Elena felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. What does that mean? It means Marcus can face court-martial for adultery, fraud, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Military courts don't look kindly on service members who abuse their deployment status to deceive their spouses financially. And his belief that deployment gives him advantages in divorce proceedings, that's completely wrong. If anything, his actions make his legal position much worse. Captain Mitchell explained that Elena had several options. She could file for divorce in civilian court while simultaneously reporting Marcus's violations to his commanding officer. The military investigation would proceed parallel to divorce proceedings, and any findings of misconduct would impact everything from Marcus's security clearance to his pension eligibility. But Elena, Captain Mitchell warned, this is going to get ugly. Marcus has been planning this for a long time, and he's not going to go down without a fight. You need to be prepared for him to escalate his tactics when he realizes you've discovered his plan. Elena left the meeting with a clear action plan and, for the first time in months, a sense of control over her situation. She wasn't the naive, trusting wife Marcus and Natalie had been manipulating anymore. She was going to fight back, and she was going to use every resource available to her, including the military justice system that Marcus had foolishly thought would protect him. That evening, Elena sat across from Natalie at their kitchen table, eating takeout Chinese food and making small talk about Natalie's day. Her sister had no idea that Elena knew everything, no idea that evidence of her affair and conspiracy was sitting in a safe deposit box Elena had opened that afternoon. Elena smiled and laughed at Natalie's stories, asked follow-up questions, and played the role of the oblivious wife perfectly. Because now she understood something Marcus and Natalie didn't. The element of surprise was her greatest weapon, and she wasn't going to waste it. Elena's newfound strategic mindset served her well over the next 3 weeks. She maintained her normal routine, working her shifts at Denver General, having dinner with Natalie, responding to Marcus's increasingly infrequent messages, while quietly building her case behind the scenes. Every interaction with her sister became an opportunity to gather more intelligence, and Elena discovered she had a talent for extracting information without arousing suspicion. During casual conversations, Elena learned that Natalie had been planning to relocate to California for months, not weeks as she'd initially claimed. Natalie had already researched real estate markets in San Diego and had been in contact with potential employers in the area. She'd even started the process of transferring her real estate license to California, something that required months of paperwork and planning. Elena also discovered that Marcus had been more careless with operational security than either he or Natalie realized. Natalie frequently mentioned details about Marcus's daily routine, his living conditions, and even specific missions that should have been classified information. Elena documented everything, knowing that Marcus's loose lips about military operations would be another serious violation in the eyes of his commanding officers. The breakthrough came when Natalie received a package from Marcus, something she tried to hide but couldn't completely conceal from Elena. Elena had been in the kitchen when the delivery arrived, and she saw Natalie quickly stuff the package into her purse before Elena could see what it was. That evening, while Natalie was in the shower, Elena found the package in Natalie's room. Inside was a jewelry box containing an engagement ring. Not just any ring, but Elena's grandmother's diamond ring that Marcus had used to propose to her 6 years earlier. Along with the ring was a letter in Marcus's handwriting, proposing to Natalie and laying out specific plans for their wedding once his divorce from Elena was finalized. Elena photographed everything before carefully repackaging it exactly as she'd found it. The engagement ring was particularly damaging evidence because it proved that Marcus had stolen marital property with sentimental value that belonged to Elena's family. In military court, theft of a spouse's personal property during deployment was considered especially egregious. Elena's attorney, James Patterson, was a civilian lawyer who specialized in military divorces. Captain Mitchell had recommended him, explaining that while military lawyers could handle the UCMJ violations, Elena needed someone who understood how military and civilian law intersect in divorce proceedings. Patterson was a former JAG officer himself, and when Elena showed him the evidence she'd gathered, his expression shifted from professional interest to something approaching excitement. "Elena, this is a prosecutor's dream case," he said, spreading the printed emails across his desk. "Marcus has violated so many regulations that his commanding officer won't have any choice but to pursue court-martial. And financial fraud? That's going to make your divorce proceedings very straightforward." Patterson explained that Marcus's attempts to hide assets and manipulate their finances weren't just unethical, they were illegal. Courts had ways of tracing financial transactions, and Marcus's deployment status wouldn't protect him from charges of financial fraud. In fact, his abuse of his military position would likely result in enhanced penalties. But Patterson also warned Elena about timing. Marcus is scheduled for leave in December, which means we're looking at a potential confrontation in less than 3 weeks. We need to decide whether to file paperwork before he returns or wait until he's stateside. Each approach has advantages and risks. Elena chose the aggressive approach. She wanted Marcus to return home to find that his carefully laid plans had been completely disrupted. Patterson filed divorce papers immediately, along with requests for emergency injunctions to freeze all joint accounts and prevent Marcus from disposing of any marital assets.
"Elena, we need to talk. This is all a misunderstanding," read one message. An hour later, "You can't just lock me out of my own house. I'm calling the police." Then, "I know Natalie told you some lies, but you can't believe everything she says." Finally, as night fell, "You're going to regret this. I have rights and I know how to use them." Elena showed each message to Patterson and Captain Mitchell, who confirmed that Marcus's threats could constitute intimidation of a witness in a military investigation. Every communication he sent was potentially more evidence for both the court-martial and divorce proceedings. The next morning brought Marcus's first direct confrontation. He appeared at Denver General Hospital during Elena's shift, still wearing his Army combat uniform and looking every inch the wronged soldier returning from deployment. Elena spotted him in the hospital lobby through the nurse's station window and immediately called security. Marcus had clearly expected his uniform and military bearing to give him an advantage, but hospital security wasn't impressed by his deployment status. When he demanded to see his wife and became increasingly agitated at being denied access to the restricted areas, they escorted him from the building with a warning about trespassing. He actually thought his uniform would intimidate hospital security, Rebecca said later, shaking her head in disbelief. Like being deployed gives him the right to harass you at work? That afternoon, Marcus tried a different approach. He went to Elena's bank, their former joint bank, and attempted to withdraw money from accounts that had been frozen by court order. The bank manager, armed with legal documentation from Patterson's office, explained that Marcus had no access to the funds pending resolution of divorce proceedings. Security cameras captured Marcus's explosive reaction, which included shouting about his service record and demanding special consideration as a deployed soldier. The bank incident was a tactical error that would haunt Marcus in court. His public meltdown, recorded on multiple security cameras, contradicted the image he wanted to project of a stable, responsible service member. More damaging was his apparent belief that his military status entitled him to special treatment in civilian financial matters. Elena's strength was tested when Marcus finally tracked down Rebecca's apartment complex. He couldn't get past the security gate, but he spent 3 hours in the parking lot, calling Elena's phone repeatedly and demanding she come down to talk to him. Elena watched from Rebecca's fourth-floor window as her husband paced beside his rental car, gesturing angrily during phone calls she assumed he was making to Natalie. Captain Mitchell arrived at the apartment complex that evening with military police. Marcus's behavior, stalking his estranged wife, making threats, attempting to circumvent court orders, had escalated his situation from a military investigation to active misconduct charges. The MPs informed Marcus that he was restricted to base pending his disciplinary hearing and was prohibited from contacting Elena except through their respective attorneys. Elena watched through Rebecca's window as the MPs escorted Marcus away from the apartment complex. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the reality that his careful plans had been completely demolished. For a moment, Elena felt something that might have been pity. Then she remembered the emails she'd read, the systematic deception, the theft of her grandmother's ring, and the pity evaporated. The military disciplinary process moved faster than Elena had expected. Within a week of Marcus's return, his commanding officer had enough evidence to convene an Article 15 hearing, a non-judicial punishment proceeding that could result in reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and restriction to base. Marcus's JAG-appointed attorney tried to negotiate a plea agreement, but the evidence was too overwhelming and the violations too serious. Elena wasn't required to testify at the Article 15 hearing, but she was permitted to attend as an affected party. She sat in the small conference room at Fort Carson, watching as her husband's military career implode in real time. The hearing officer, a stern colonel with 30 years of service, read through the charges with obvious disapproval. Marcus had violated Article 134 of the UCMJ by committing adultery, which in military law wasn't just a personal failing, but a crime that undermines good order and discipline. He'd violated Article 86 by misusing government communication systems for personal affairs. Most seriously, he'd violated Article 92 by disclosing classified information about troop movements and operations to unauthorized personnel, namely Natalie. The financial fraud charges were perhaps the most damaging to Marcus's defense. Military courts took a dim view of service members who abused their deployment status to deceive their families. Marcus's systematic transfer of marital assets to hidden accounts, combined with his theft of Elena's personal property, painted a picture of calculated financial abuse. Marcus's attorney tried to argue that deployment stress and combat exposure had affected his judgment, but medical records didn't support claims of PTSD or other service-connected mental health issues. The hearing officer seemed particularly unimpressed with attempts to blame Marcus's choices on external factors. The punishment was swift and comprehensive. Marcus was reduced in rank from sergeant first class to specialist, forfeiting 2/3 of his pay for 6 months and confined to base for 60 days. More significantly, he received a letter of reprimand that would effectively end any hope of future promotion or reenlistment. His security clearance was suspended pending further investigation, and he was recommended for administrative separation from the Army. Elena felt oddly detached as she listened to Marcus's sentence being read. This man, who had once seemed so powerful and self-assured, was being systematically stripped of the identity he'd built over 15 years of military service. His dreams of promotion, of a comfortable retirement, of starting fresh with Natalie in California, all of it was crumbling because he'd underestimated the woman he'd tried to deceive. After the hearing, Marcus's attorney approached Elena in the hallway. "My client would like to speak with you about reaching a settlement agreement for the divorce proceedings," he said. "He's prepared to be reasonable about asset division." Elena almost laughed at the word reasonable. Marcus had spent months planning to leave her with nothing, and now that his scheme had backfired, he wanted to negotiate. She looked past the attorney to where Marcus stood near the exit, no longer wearing the uniform he'd been so proud of, looking lost and defeated. "Tell your client he can speak to my attorney," Elena replied. "I'm done having direct communication with people who lie to me." As Elena walked out of Fort Carson that day, she realized she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine peace. The man who had tried to destroy her life was facing the consequences of his choices, and she had discovered reserves of strength and resilience she never knew she possessed. Marcus had intended to leave her broken and financially ruined. Instead, his betrayal had revealed just how strong she really was. The divorce proceedings began in January 2023, and Elena quickly learned that Marcus's military downfall was only the beginning of his legal troubles. What had started as a personal betrayal had evolved into a complex web of financial crimes that extended far beyond their marriage. During the discovery phase of the divorce, Patterson's forensic accountant uncovered financial irregularities that shocked even Elena's attorney. Marcus hadn't just hidden money from Elena, he'd been systematically defrauding the military for over 2 years. Fraudulent expense reports, falsified travel claims, and misappropriated government funds painted a picture of a man whose dishonesty extended into every aspect of his life. "Elena, we're looking at federal charges now," Patterson explained during a meeting in his downtown Denver office. "Marcus has been filing false claims for combat pay, family separation allowance, and hazardous duty pay for periods when he wasn't eligible. The amounts we're talking about exceed $50,000. The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd been married to a man she didn't recognize. Not just someone who had cheated on her, but someone who had been stealing from the government while deployed overseas. The Marcus she'd fallen in love with 7 years ago had either never existed or had been consumed by greed and entitlement. Meanwhile, Natalie had vanished completely. Her supposed return to Phoenix had been another lie. Elena discovered that Natalie had actually flown to Las Vegas, then disappeared entirely. Her real estate license had been suspended for abandoning clients, her apartment in Phoenix had been abandoned, and even their few mutual friends had no idea where she'd gone. Elena hired a private investigator, David Chen, to locate her sister. It wasn't about revenge. Elena needed Natalie found for legal reasons. As a co-conspirator in Marcus's schemes and the recipient of stolen marital property, Natalie was a crucial witness in both the military investigation and the divorce proceedings. Chen's investigation revealed that Natalie had been planning her disappearance for months. She'd liquidated her retirement accounts, closed her business partnerships, and even sold her car, all while living in Elena's guest room and pretending to be the supportive sister. The timing suggested that Natalie had known about Marcus's military investigation before it became official, possibly tipped off by Marcus himself. "Your sister is smart," Chen reported during their meeting at a coffee shop near the hospital. "She's covered her tracks well, but she made one crucial mistake. She's been using her real identity to access medical care. I've traced her to a clinic in Tucson, Arizona. She's pregnant." The news of Natalie's pregnancy added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Elena's first emotion was rage, not just at the affair, but at the realization that Marcus and Natalie had been planning to start a family while systematically destroying Elena's life. Her second emotion was a strange sort of pity for the unborn child who would inherit this legacy of deception and criminality.
Marcus's reaction to the pregnancy news was captured in a series of desperate phone calls he made to Elena despite the court-ordered no-contact restrictions. Elena's new phone number was unlisted, but Marcus had apparently convinced someone at the hospital to give him the information. Each violation of the protective order was documented and forwarded to his commanding officer, further complicating his legal situation. "Elena, please, you have to understand," Marcus pleaded in one voicemail that Elena played for Patterson. "Natalie is carrying my child. I know I made mistakes, but we need to work something out. I can't lose everything because of one bad decision." Elena felt a cold fury at his characterization of a year-long affair and systematic financial fraud as one bad decision. This was the same man who had once lectured her about honor and integrity, who had worn his uniform with pride and spoken about serving his country. Now he was begging for mercy while minimizing the scope of his betrayal. The federal investigation began in February when military investigators turned over their findings to the FBI. Marcus's fraudulent financial activities had crossed state lines and involved multiple government agencies, making it a federal matter. Elena found herself cooperating with FBI agents who were building a case against her estranged husband for wire fraud, theft of government property, and conspiracy. Special Agent Sarah Kim, the lead investigator on Marcus's case, explained to Elena that her cooperation was crucial but also potentially dangerous. Marcus is facing serious federal time, possibly 10 to 15 years if convicted on all charges. People in his situation sometimes become desperate and unpredictable. Elena's life had become a strange routine of legal meetings, depositions, and security precautions. She'd moved out of Rebecca's apartment and into her own place, a secure high-rise with doorman service and surveillance cameras. The hospital had assigned her a security escort for her shifts, and she'd taken a self-defense class recommended by Agent Kim. The most difficult part wasn't the security measures or legal complications, it was the gradual realization of how completely she'd been deceived. Elena spent hours in therapy with Dr. Foster, processing not just Marcus's betrayal, but her own self-doubt about missing so many warning signs. "You couldn't have known," Dr. Foster reminded her during one particularly difficult session. Marcus was living a double life so completely that even trained investigators needed months to uncover the full scope of his deception. You were dealing with a master manipulator, not someone having a typical affair. Elena's colleagues at Denver General had been incredibly supportive, but she could sense the whispered conversations and curious looks. Her personal life had become the subject of hospital gossip, and she found herself avoiding the break room and eating lunch alone to escape the well-meaning but intrusive questions. The breakthrough in Natalie's location came in March, when she made the mistake of using her real identity to register for prenatal care at a clinic in Tucson. Chen's contacts in Arizona confirmed that she was living under an assumed name, but had been forced to use her real Social Security number for medical insurance purposes. Elena made the decision to confront her sister in person. Against the advice of Patterson and Agent Kim, she drove to Tucson with Chen as her security escort. Elena needed to look Natalie in the eye and get answers to questions that had been haunting her for months. They found Natalie working at a small boutique in downtown Tucson, her pregnancy barely visible, but her appearance dramatically changed. She dyed her hair dark brown and was wearing contact lenses that changed her eye color. When she saw Elena walk into the store, her face went white and she actually took a step backward. "Hello," Natalie said calmly. "We need to talk." The confrontation lasted less than 20 minutes, but it provided Elena with the closure she'd been seeking. Natalie was defiant at first, claiming that Elena had never appreciated Marcus and that she'd simply given him the love and support he deserved. But when Elena began reciting specific details from the emails and financial records, Natalie's bravado crumbled. "You don't understand," Natalie said, her voice breaking. "Marcus said you were planning to divorce him anyway. He said you'd grown apart and were just waiting for him to get back from deployment. I thought I was helping him transition to a better life." Elena stared at her sister, this person she'd trusted completely, who had lived in her home and ate her food while systematically betraying her. "Did you help him steal my grandmother's ring too? Was that also about helping him transition?"
Natalie had no answer for that, and Elena realized she didn't need one. Her sister had chosen to believe Marcus's lies because they justified what she wanted to do anyway. The pregnancy, the disappearance, the elaborate deception, all of it was the result of two selfish people who had convinced themselves that their desires mattered more than the person they were destroying. Elena left Tucson with Natalie's current address and contact information, which she immediately turned over to the FBI and Patterson. She felt no satisfaction in tracking down her sister, no sense of victory in seeing her reduced to working retail in a strange city. There was only a hollow recognition that the sister she'd grown up with, the person she'd trusted with her deepest secrets, had never really existed at all. By April 2023, Marcus's legal situation had deteriorated beyond anything Elena could have imagined when she first discovered those bank statements on his desk. The federal grand jury had issued indictments on 12 separate charges, including wire fraud, theft of government property, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act for misusing military communication systems. Elena found herself at the center of a media storm she never wanted. Local news outlets had picked up the story of the decorated Army sergeant who had defrauded the military while conducting an affair with his wife's sister. The details were too sensational for reporters to ignore, and Elena's name appeared in newspapers and television broadcasts across Colorado, despite her efforts to maintain privacy. "Military wife exposes husband's elaborate fraud scheme," read the headline in the Denver Post. The article painted Elena as a heroic whistleblower, but she felt anything but heroic. She was simply a woman trying to rebuild her life while navigating an increasingly complex legal system. The media attention brought unexpected consequences. Elena started receiving messages from other military spouses who had experienced similar betrayals. Women from across the country reached out through social media and email, sharing stories of financial manipulation, hidden affairs, and abuse of military benefits by their partners. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a military family counselor from Fort Bragg, contacted Elena with a proposal that would change the trajectory of her healing process. "Elena, your case has exposed systemic issues that affect thousands of military families," Dr. Walsh explained during a video call. "Would you consider speaking at a conference about financial abuse in military marriages?" Elena's initial reaction was absolute refusal. She had no desire to become the public face of military spouse victimization, and the thought of speaking publicly about her most painful experiences felt overwhelming. But Dr. Foster encouraged her to consider it as part of her healing process. "You've already done the hardest part," Dr. Foster told her during their weekly session. "You've survived the betrayal, uncovered the truth, and held Marcus accountable. Now you have the opportunity to help other women recognize the warning signs you missed." Meanwhile, Marcus's attorney had been trying desperately to negotiate a plea agreement. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and a trial would likely result in the maximum sentence on all charges. Marcus's military career was already over. He'd been administratively separated from the Army with an other-than-honorable discharge, losing all benefits and eligibility for veterans programs. Elena received updates about plea negotiations through Patterson, though she had no direct input into federal criminal proceedings. Marcus was apparently willing to plead guilty to most charges in exchange for a reduced sentence, but federal prosecutors were demanding full restitution to the government and cooperation in investigating other potential fraud cases within his unit. The financial investigation had revealed that Marcus wasn't the only soldier in his unit engaging in fraudulent activities. His detailed records, kept meticulously for his own protection, had inadvertently exposed a network of soldiers who had been manipulating the system for personal gain. Marcus's cooperation could lead to prosecutions of several other service members, potentially reducing his sentence significantly. Elena felt conflicted about Marcus's potential cooperation. Part of her wanted him to face the maximum penalty for what he'd done to their marriage and to the military he'd sworn to serve. But another part of her recognized that his information could prevent other families from experiencing what she'd endured. The divorce proceedings, meanwhile, were nearing resolution. With Marcus's financial fraud exposed and his military career destroyed, asset division became relatively straightforward. Elena would receive the house, her retirement accounts, and compensation for the stolen personal property. Marcus would be responsible for all legal fees and would owe substantial restitution to the government. But Elena had decided she didn't want the house. Too many memories lived in those rooms, not just of Marcus's betrayal, but of the naive woman she'd been who had trusted so completely and questioned so little. She planned to sell it and use the proceeds to start fresh somewhere new. The decision to leave Colorado entirely came after a particularly difficult day in May. Elena had been shopping for groceries when she encountered Marcus's mother, Linda Rodriguez, in the produce section of the King Soopers near her apartment. The confrontation was brief but painful. "Elena, you've destroyed my son's life," Linda said, her voice shaking with anger. "Whatever problems you two had could have been worked out in counseling. You didn't have to involve the military and the FBI." Elena stared at this woman who had once treated her like a daughter, who had welcomed her into the Rodriguez family with warmth and affection. "Linda, your son stole from the government and cheated on me with my sister for over a year. I didn't destroy his life, he did." "Marcus made mistakes, but he's still a good man," Linda insisted. "He served his country for 15 years. That should count for something." Elena felt a familiar surge of the anger she'd been working to process in therapy. Serving his country while stealing from it doesn't make him a good man. And planning to leave me financially ruined while he started a new life with Natalie doesn't make him a good man either. The encounter left Elena shaken and reinforced her decision to leave Colorado. She'd built a life there based on Marcus's military career and their shared future. With both of those things gone, she had no reason to stay in a place where she might encounter reminders of her former life around every corner. Elena submitted her resignation to Denver General Hospital, effective at the end of June. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who had become more than just a colleague during Elena's darkest months, helped her research nursing opportunities in other states. They settled on Seattle, Washington, a city far from military bases where Elena could start completely fresh. The decision to speak at Dr. Walsh's conference came during Elena's final therapy session with Dr. Foster. "I think I'm ready," Elena said, surprising even herself. "Not to be a victim advocate or a public speaker, but to tell my story once, completely, and then move on." The Military Family Life Conference was held at a hotel in Virginia Beach, Virginia, in late June. Elena's presentation was scheduled for the final day, and she'd spent weeks preparing remarks that balanced honesty about her experience with practical advice for other military spouses. Standing before an audience of nearly 300 military family members, counselors, and legal professionals, Elena felt a strange sense of completion. For months, her story had been told in fragments, in court documents, FBI interviews, media reports, and therapy sessions. This was her opportunity to tell it completely, in her own words, on her own terms. "I want to start by saying that I'm not here as an expert or an advocate," Elena began, looking out at faces that reflected varying degrees of curiosity, sympathy, and recognition. "I'm here as someone who learned the hard way that love and trust don't protect you from deception, but knowledge and preparation can help you survive it." Elena spoke for 30 minutes about warning signs she'd missed, resources she'd wished she'd known about, and the importance of maintaining financial awareness even in the strongest marriages. She talked about the military legal system, the intersection of criminal and civil law, and the support networks that had helped her rebuild her life. But mostly, she talked about transformation, how surviving betrayal had taught her about her own strength, resilience, and capacity for rebuilding. She ended with words that would later be quoted in military spouse support groups across the country. "I didn't choose what happened to me, but I chose how I responded to it. That choice made all the difference." The response was overwhelming. Elena spent 2 hours after her presentation talking to individual attendees, exchanging contact information with counselors and legal advocates, and listening to stories from other spouses who had faced similar challenges. For the first time since discovering those emails on Natalie's laptop, Elena felt like her experience had served a purpose beyond her own survival. Elena Reed stood on the balcony of her new apartment in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, watching the July sunset paint the Puget Sound in shades of pink and gold.
3 weeks had passed since she'd left Colorado behind, and for the first time in over a year, she felt like she could breathe freely. The weight of legal proceedings, media attention, and constant vigilance had lifted, replaced by the simple pleasure of anonymity in a city where nobody knew her story. Her new job at Seattle Children's Hospital had been everything she'd hoped for: challenging, rewarding, and completely divorced from military culture. Her colleagues knew her only as Elena Reed, an experienced pediatric nurse, not as the woman whose husband had made headlines for defrauding the Army. The distinction felt liberating in ways she hadn't expected. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Patterson back in Denver. Marcus's sentencing had been scheduled for August 15th. After months of negotiations, he'd accepted a plea agreement that would send him to federal prison for 7 years. The deal required him to pay full restitution to the government, nearly $90,000 in fraudulent claims and stolen funds, and to cooperate fully with ongoing investigations into his former unit. Elena felt surprisingly little satisfaction at the news. 7 years seemed both too long and not long enough for what Marcus had done. Too long because somewhere beneath all the anger and betrayal, she still remembered the man she'd fallen in love with. Not long enough because that same man had spent over a year systematically destroying everything she'd built her life around. A separate text from Agent Kim provided an update on Natalie's situation. Elena's sister had been arrested in Tucson the previous week on charges related to receiving stolen property and conspiracy to commit fraud. The engagement ring, Elena's grandmother's ring, had been recovered from a pawn shop where Natalie had sold it to pay for medical expenses related to her pregnancy. Elena had asked Agent Kim to have the ring returned to her, but when she held the small box containing it, she realized she felt nothing. The sentimental value had been destroyed along with everything else Marcus and Natalie had touched. She donated the ring to a charity auction, unable to bear the sight of something that had once symbolized love and commitment. But pregnancy had added complications to Natalie's legal situation. Elena learned through Chen, the private investigator, that Natalie had given birth to a daughter in July. The baby was healthy, but Natalie's impending incarceration meant the child would likely be placed with foster care or relatives. Elena felt a complex mixture of sadness and relief that she wouldn't be asked to take responsibility for her sister's child. Dr. Walsh had been calling regularly since Elena's conference presentation, encouraging her to consider writing a book about her experience. "Elena, you have a unique perspective on military spouse advocacy," Dr. Walsh explained during one of their calls. "Your story could help thousands of families recognize financial abuse before it destroys their lives." Elena wasn't ready for that level of public exposure, but she had started writing, not for publication, but for her own healing. Her therapist in Seattle, Dr. Amanda Chen, had suggested journaling as a way to process the massive changes in her life. What started as simple daily entries had evolved into a detailed account of her journey from victim to survivor. The writing process had been surprisingly therapeutic. Elena found herself able to examine her experience with growing objectivity, recognizing patterns she'd missed in real time and identifying moments when she'd shown strength she didn't know she possessed. The woman who emerged from these pages was someone Elena was learning to respect and even admire. August brought unexpected news that would test Elena's newfound peace. Marcus had been granted permission to write her a letter as part of his pre-sentencing preparation. His attorney had explained that expressions of remorse and accountability could potentially influence the judge's final decision. Elena had the right to refuse to receive the letter, but curiosity won over caution. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered to Patterson's office, and forwarded to Elena with a note that she should read it with her therapist present. Elena chose instead to read it alone in her apartment, wanting to confront Marcus's words without anyone else's interpretation or support. The letter was 5 pages long, handwritten in Marcus's careful script. It began with apologies that felt genuine but insufficient, acknowledgments of harm that seemed incomplete, and explanations that sounded more like justifications. Marcus wrote about deployment stress, about feeling disconnected from Elena, about making impulsive decisions that spiraled out of control. But buried in the 4th page was something that surprised Elena: genuine insight into what he'd destroyed. Marcus wrote about realizing that Elena had been the best thing in his life, that her loyalty and love had been gifts he'd thrown away for temporary excitement and financial gain. He acknowledged that no apology could repair what he'd done, but he wanted Elena to know that he understood the magnitude of his betrayal. The letter ended with something Elena hadn't expected: Marcus's blessing for her fresh start. He wrote that he hoped she would find happiness and love again, that she deserved better than what he'd given her, and that he would carry the weight of his choices for the rest of his life. Elena read the letter twice, then put it in her desk drawer. She felt no urge to respond, no desire for continued contact, but neither did she feel the anger that Marcus's name had once triggered. The letter was an ending, not reconciliation, but closure. September brought Elena's first real test of her new life when she met David Park, a pediatric surgeon at the hospital. David was recently divorced himself, and their conversations over coffee in the hospital cafeteria gradually evolved into something that felt like genuine connection. Elena found herself enjoying his company without the hypervigilance that had characterized her interactions with men since Marcus's deployment. When David asked her to dinner at a restaurant overlooking Elliott Bay, Elena's first instinct was panic. She wasn't ready for dating, wasn't sure she'd ever be ready to trust someone with her heart again. But Dr. Chen encouraged her to consider the difference between being ready for a relationship and being ready for human connection. Elena, you've spent the past year learning to trust yourself, Dr. Chen observed during their session. That's the foundation for eventually learning to trust someone else. You don't have to marry this man or even see him again after dinner, but you can allow yourself to enjoy his company. The dinner was surprisingly easy. David was funny, thoughtful, and refreshingly direct about his own struggles with rebuilding after divorce. Elena found herself sharing more than she'd intended about her recent move to Seattle, though she kept the details of her past deliberately vague. David seemed to understand that she had reasons for privacy and didn't push for information she wasn't ready to share. Elena's final conversation with Patterson came in October when all legal proceedings had been concluded. The divorce was finalized, Marcus was serving his sentence at a federal prison in Texas, and Natalie had been sentenced to 18 months in a minimum security facility in Arizona. Elena's portion of the marital assets, combined with restitution payments, had given her enough financial security to start over completely. Elena, I've been practicing family law for 25 years, Patterson told her during their final phone call. I've never seen someone handle a situation like yours with such grace and strategic thinking. You turned what could have been complete destruction into an opportunity for rebuilding. That takes remarkable strength. As autumn settled over Seattle, Elena established routines that felt sustainable and healthy. She worked her shifts at the hospital with genuine enthusiasm, exploring the city on her days off, and slowly building friendships with colleagues and neighbors. Her apartment was small, but filled with things she'd chosen herself: books she wanted to read, art that made her smile, furniture that reflected her taste rather than compromises made with a partner. The woman Elena had become was different from the one Marcus had left behind in Colorado. She was more cautious, but also more confident, more aware of red flags, but also more willing to trust her own judgment. She'd learned that survival was possible even when everything familiar disappeared, that strength could be discovered in the darkest moments, and that starting over wasn't just possible, it could be liberating. Elena's story wasn't a fairy tale with a perfect ending. She still had difficult days, when loneliness felt overwhelming, moments when trust seemed impossible, and times when the magnitude of what she'd lost hit her unexpectedly. But she also had something she'd never possessed before: complete confidence in her ability to handle whatever life brought her way. The last entry in Elena's journal, written on a rainy December evening with Christmas lights twinkling in the apartment across the courtyard, captured the essence of her transformation. I used to think that love meant trusting completely and asking no questions. Now I know that real love includes trusting yourself enough to ask the right questions and strong enough to hear the answers. I may not know what my future holds, but I know who I am now. That's enough. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now.
And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.